I'm Franklin. In the Mississippi Delta, they say time doesn't move forward. The air in southern Mississippi doesn't move. It just sits on your lungs like a wet, dirty blanket. By July 1996, the heat had turned the Delta into a slow-motion hallucination. Detective Elias Thorne sat in his rusted Chevy, the vinyl seat sticking to his back like a second skin. He was staring at a sycamore tree draped in Spanish moss, located just outside a dying town called Blackwood. Hanging from the lowest branch was a nest, a complex interlocking sculpture of dried reeds, human hair, and sun-bleached heron bones. It was the third one this week. No bodies, just the nests. "It's just folk art, Elias," the local sheriff had told him, spitting tobacco into the dust. "The swamp folk get bored. They string up these charms to keep the blight off the crops. Don't go making a federal case out of a pile of sticks." But Elias knew the geometry of those sticks. He had seen them before in the evidence lockers of unsolved cases from the 1970s. They weren't charms. They were markers. A way of saying, this piece of earth has been appraised. The case started with a girl named Sarah, a waitress at a roadside diner who vanished between her shift and her front door. No struggle, no blood. Just her bicycle left in the middle of a cane field with one of those nests resting in the basket. As Elias walked deeper into the cane, the hum of the cicadas grew so loud it sounded like a mechanical scream. The ground here was strange. The soil was a dark, bruised purple, and the stalks of cane grew twisted as if they were trying to pull themselves back into the earth. He reached the center of the field and found the altar. It wasn't a stone slab. It was a rusted industrial drainage pipe that rose out of the mud like a jagged tooth. Surrounding it were circles of those yellow ribbons Elias had been finding, thousands of them tied to the dead stalks. They fluttered in the stagnant air like a swarm of silent insects. He knelt by the pipe. The smell was overwhelming. A metallic, chemical sweetness that cut through the scent of decay. It was the smell of the sterling chemical plants upriver, the ones that had closed 10 years ago. He shined his flashlight down into the pipe. The beam didn't hit water. It hit a layer of white, calcified powder, and sticking out of the powder was a small, plastic ID bracelet. St. Jude's Municipal Hospital, Pediatric Ward. Elias felt a cold shiver that the Mississippi sun couldn't touch. The hospital in Chicago was 1,000 miles away, but the merchandise was here. He realized then that the Blackwater Cipher wasn't a religious ritual. The swamp cult that the locals whispered about wasn't worshiping a demon. They were serving a logistics chain. The twisted nests were a primitive mapping system for a massive underground disposal network, a place where the waste from the corporate experiments of the North was sent to be dissolved in the acidic chemistry of the southern swamps. "You're trespassing on private property, Detective," a voice drawled from behind him. Elias didn't turn. He knew the sound of a Remington pump action sliding into place. "The Landry family has owned this dirt since before the war," the voice continued. It was smooth, educated, and utterly devoid of empathy. "We have a contract with the land. We keep it fed, and in return, the land keeps our secrets. It's a closed circle. Why would you want to break a circle?" Elias looked at the yellow ribbons. He understood now. The ribbons weren't for a ritual. They were labels. Each ribbon represented a deposit. The swamp wasn't a graveyard. It was a massive, living vat of industrial acid, and Sarah hadn't been kidnapped by a ghost. She had been collected to balance the books. "The circle is flat, Thorne," the man said, stepping into the light. He was wearing an expensive linen suit, looking like a ghost of the Old South, and you're just a speck of dust on the edge of it. Elias Thorne didn't look back at the man with the shotgun. He kept his eyes on the drainage pipe, on that small plastic bracelet that connected a high-tech Chicago nightmare to this low-country swamp. The click of the Remington safety was the only sound breaking the rhythmic, electric hum of the cicadas. "The Landrys don't like visitors, Detective," the man in the linen suit said. His name was Bo Landry, the youngest of a dynasty built on blood and sugar, especially not the kind that go poking around in the plumbing. "It's unneighborly." "I'm not here to be neighborly, Bo," Elias said, finally turning around. He didn't reach for his sidearm. In heat like this, everything moved too slow for a shootout. "I'm here about Sarah and the 3 others who went missing during the harvest." Bo smiled, a thin white line in the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "People in the Delta don't go missing, they just drift. The swamp takes what it needs, and the rest, well, the rest just becomes part of the scenery. You're an outsider. You see a crime, we see a cycle." Bo lowered the gun slightly, but the tension didn't break. He gestured with his chin toward the sprawling, rusted silhouette of the old Landry processing plant on the horizon. "My father made a deal back in '72, a group of men from the north, men with very clean shoes and very cold eyes, needed a place to process their biological overhead. We had the land, the lack of oversight, and a population that doesn't ask questions as long as the check's clear. We aren't a cult, Elias. We're a utility." Elias walked past him, headed toward his truck. He knew he couldn't arrest Bo here, not in a county where the judge was Bo's uncle and the soil itself was a landfill for corporate sins. That night, Elias stayed in a roadside motel where the walls were stained with nicotine and the neon sign hummed like a dying hornet. He spread the stolen files from the local records office across the bed. He began to map the disappearances not by date, but by the nest locations. When he overlaid the map of the nests with a geological survey of the county's groundwater, the pattern emerged. A perfect, interlocking spiral. The nests weren't random. They were markers for injection sites. The Landry family wasn't just dumping bodies. They were using the natural limestone caverns beneath the swamp as a massive living filtration system. They were pumping chemical waste and biological surplus into the deep earth, letting the slow, acidic water dissolve the evidence over decades. The yellow ribbons were a coding system. Each color or knot pattern indicated the type of material deposited. A yellow ribbon with a double knot meant pediatric. A black ribbon meant chemical experimental. Around 3 a.m., a heavy sulfurous fog rolled in off the bayou. Elias was startled by a soft scratching at his door. He grabbed his service revolver and eased the door open. On the welcome mat sat a small wooden carving, a bird with its wings pinned back by thorns, and tied to its neck was a black ribbon. He looked out into the parking lot. In the pale, sickly light of the motel sign, he saw them, the swamp folk. They weren't ghosts or monsters. They were the workers from the Landry fields, men and women with skin grayed by chemical exposure, their lungs whistling with every breath. They stood in a semicircle, silent, watching him with eyes that had seen the bottom of those pipes. One of them, a man whose hands were stained a permanent, bruised purple, stepped forward. He didn't speak. He simply pointed toward the old sugar mill. "The king in rags," the man whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "He's calling for the final audit. Sarah, she's still in the pre-wash. You go now, or the water takes her." The man handed Elias a rusted iron key. It was tagged with a faded label, Basement Level 4, Cooling Intake. Elias realized that the king wasn't a deity. It was the name of the massive, automated processing unit at the heart of the Landry mill, a machine that had been running since the late 70s, turning human remains into a sterile, untraceable slurry. He climbed into a Chevy and floored it toward the mill. The road was a blur of dark cane and hanging moss. As he approached the rusted iron gates, he saw the torches, hundreds of them. The workers were gathering, not to stop him, but to witness the end of the harvest. The air grew colder as he neared the mill. The smell of the chemicals was so thick now he could taste it on his teeth. The same metallic sweetness from the St. Jude's basement. The Landry mill didn't just process sugar. It processed the memory of people. And inside the cooling intake, Sarah was waiting for her turn to be erased. The old Landry sugar mill sat in the basin of the swamp like a rotting iron carcass. It was a cathedral of rust, draped in decades of thick, oily vines that seemed to be trying to choke the life out of the machinery. Elias stepped out of his truck, the mud sucking at his boots with a sound like a dying man's gasp. The silence here wasn't empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the low-frequency thrum of something deep beneath the foundation, a mechanical heartbeat that Elias felt in the marrow of his bones. He didn't use his flashlight. The moon, hanging low and sickly yellow over the delta, provided enough light to see the rows of rusted boilers and the tangled labyrinth of copper pipes that snaked across the ceiling like veins. Everything was covered in a fine, white powder, the same calcified dust he'd seen in the drainage pipes. It felt like walking through the lungs of a giant that had been smoking for 100 years. As he moved toward the central processing hall, he noticed the decorations. They weren't just nests anymore. Thousands of strips of black and yellow plastic were tied to the valves and levers, fluttering in the draft. In the center of the hall stood the king. It wasn't a man. It was a massive vertical industrial centrifuge, 30 feet tall, salvaged from some decommissioned northern facility. It was draped in tattered oil-stained tarps that hung like a ragged coronation robe. The machine was ancient, leaking a thick, dark lubricant that pooled at its base like black blood. From within the iron casing came a wet, rhythmic slap, slap, slap. The sound of something heavy being turned in a cold liquid. Elias bypassed the main floor and found the service stairs. The iron was so thin from corrosion, it felt like stepping on dried leaves. He descended into level B4. The air here turned cold, a sharp, artificial chill that hit him like a physical blow. The smell of the swamp vanished, replaced by a scent he couldn't quite place, yet it made the back of his neck prickle. Ozone and a faint, chemical sweetness, like a sterile room that hadn't been cleaned in years. He found the cooling intake. It was a long concrete corridor lined with stainless steel sinks. Above each sink was a frosted glass window. Through the condensation, he saw the shapes. They were suspended in a thick bluish gel, not quite frozen, but perfectly preserved, their features blurred by the glass and the chemical haze. There were no labels, no names, just small, blue-inked stamps on the glass. Batch 09 audit checked. In the furthest corner of the room, he saw her. Sarah was strapped to a tilted metal table. She wasn't dead, but her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, her pupils blown wide. A thin, translucent tube was threaded into the vein in her neck, pulsing with that same dark, oxygenated fluid that seemed to be the lifeblood of this entire hidden world. "The soil is poor here, Detective," a voice whispered from the darkness behind the cooling units. Bo Landry stepped into the dim light. He wasn't holding the shotgun anymore. He was holding a small, silver-plated instrument, a long, thin needle used for drawing spinal fluid. He looked at the girl with the detached curiosity of a gardener inspecting a prize orchid. We tried traditional fertilizers. We tried the usual runoff. But the land wouldn't take it, Bo said, his voice a smooth, terrifying drawl. Then the architects came. They told us that the human body is the greatest chemical processor ever built. If you feed the earth through a living filter, if you let the organs strip the toxins before they hit the groundwater, the sugar grows sweeter. The cycle stays clean. Bo traced a line across Sarah's arm, right where a faint bruised mark was beginning to emerge under her skin. A mark that looked like a series of numbers. She's a high-quality filter, Elias. Young, strong heart. She can process 3, maybe 4 liters of the batch before her kidneys give out. Then we let the king upstairs finish the job. Nothing is wasted. We don't just hide the evidence here. My prevrащаем его в урожай. Elias felt the rage boil over, but it was a cold, heavy anger. He looked at the walls, at the miles of copper tubing, and realized the mill wasn't just a factory. It was a massive biological kidney for a city that lived 1,000 miles away. The king in rags was the final stage, a grinder that turned the spent filters into the very slurry that fed the cane fields. He reached for his revolver, but the air in the room suddenly changed. A heavy hiss echoed through the pipes. A thick yellow mist began to pour from the ventilation grates. The same gas that had snapped the leashes in the Chicago archives years before. The audit is starting, Detective, Bo said, pulling a respirator from his linen jacket. And you're not an auditor. You're just more organic overhead. The yellow mist didn't just burn Elias's lungs. It peeled back the layers of his reality. As he collapsed against the cold stainless steel of the cooling unit, the rusted walls of the laundry mill seemed to dissolve. The rhythmic slap, slap, slap of the king. Upstairs transformed into a pulse, a deep, organic throb that vibrated through the concrete floor. Elias looked at Sarah. Through the haze of the gas, her eyes weren't empty anymore. They were reflecting something, a vast geometry of shadows that stretched far beyond the borders of Mississippi. You think you're the hunter, Elias? Bo Landry's voice drifted through the fog, sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. But you've been following a trail we laid for you 20 years ago. You didn't find the mill. The mill summoned its new auditor. Elias tried to raise his revolver, but his arm felt like it was made of lead. He watched as Bo reached into the pocket of his linen suit and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. He didn't look at Elias with malice. He looked at him with the cold, professional pity of a man reading a death warrant. My family, we're just the caretakers of the soil, Bo whispered, kneeling beside him. We provide the acid and the shadows. Но те, кто прислал тебя, они искали не пропавшую официантку. Они искали того, кто сможет вынести правду, не сойдя с ума. Ты ведь всегда видел паттерны, верно? В складках одежды, в расположении костей, в шуме вентиляции. Ты видел их, потому что ты один из них. Bo reached out and grabbed Elias's wrist, pulling back the sleeve of his jacket. Under the flickering blue light of the cooling room, Elias saw it. The skin on his forearm began to itch, a dull throbbing heat rising to the surface. A series of faint white lines, scars he had lived with since childhood, told they were from a car accident, began to glow with a sickly, bruised light. They weren't scars. They were the remnants of a faded surgical brand. Batch 09. You weren't investigating a disappearance, Elias, Bo said, his voice dropping to a jagged rasp. You were returning to inventory. You were the one who got away from the northern labs when you were 5 years old. The glitch in the system. They've been watching your pulse, your stress levels, and your deductive instincts for 3 decades. They wanted to see if their product could track itself back to the source. The realization hit Elias harder than the gas. Every case he had solved, every instinct he had followed, was a programmed response. He wasn't a detective. He was a bloodhound bred to find the very machine that created him. Upstairs, the king gave a final, mechanical shudder and ground to a halt. The silence that followed was absolute. "The cycle is complete," Bo said, standing up. "Sarah wasn't the bait. You were. She's just the vessel we'll use to carry your data back to the architects." Elias looked at Sarah one last time. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a mirror. Behind her, the door to the B4 level opened, and men in the same tailored gray suits Elias had seen in his recurring nightmares stepped into the room. They weren't carrying guns. They were carrying a mobile surgical kit and a heavy, lead-lined briefcase marked with a stylized, geometric S. "Audit finalized," one of the men said, his voice devoid of any human inflection. "Subject Thorne has successfully self-navigated to the processing center. Heart rate 140, adrenaline peak, quality exceptional." Elias tried to scream, but the yellow gas had finally reached his vocal cords. As the world turned into a flat, gray void, he realized the ultimate horror. He hadn't spent his life fighting the darkness. He had been its most successful experiment. The last thing he felt was the cold sting of a needle in his neck and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the swamp, which sounded more and more like a heartbeat that wasn't his own.